"You're delaying this entire flight for nothing," the voice cut through the cabin, sharp and impatient, carrying just enough authority to make people turn their heads, and just enough arrogance to make them stay silent. The overhead bins were already closed, the seatbelt signs glowing steady, and outside the oval windows the late afternoon sun washed the runway in a pale gold haze. But inside row 16A, the tension felt heavier than the pressurized air as Officer Ryan Cole stood in the aisle, one hand braced against the seat back, the other hovering near the small, worn bag resting at the feet of the man he had decided didn't belong. Daniel Hayes didn't look up right away, his posture relaxed, almost indifferent, as if the rising irritation around him had nothing to do with him, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the narrow window where heat shimmered above the tarmac like a mirage. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," Cole continued, louder. Now, aware of the eyes on him, feeding off them, "identify the device in your possession or we're going to have a problem before this aircraft even leaves the ground." A few passengers shifted, a phone discreetly lifted, someone whispered, but Hayes remained still, the kind of stillness that didn't invite confrontation and yet somehow provoked it. The flight attendant, Emily Carter, paused halfway down the aisle, her practiced smile fading just enough to reveal concern, because she had seen difficult passengers before, angry ones, confused ones. But this was different, this was quiet, controlled, like a storm that hadn't decided yet whether to move. "It's just an old radio," Hayes said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying a gravel edge that didn't match his otherwise unremarkable appearance, and for a brief second the cabin seemed to lean in, as if the tone mattered more than the words. Cole let out a short laugh. Dismissive, sharp, "an old radio? On a commercial flight? You expect me to believe that?" He reached down, not quite touching it, but close enough to signal ownership, authority, control. "You don't get to bring relics like this on board without clearance, sir." The word "sir" flattened, stripped of respect, reshaped into something else entirely. Hayes' eyes shifted then, not to Cole, but to the device, a small, weathered unit with edges softened by time, its surface marked by faint scratches that told stories no one in that cabin could read, and for a moment his fingers hovered over it, not hesitant, not uncertain, just precise, as if every movement had already been decided long before this flight, long before this moment. Somewhere beyond the sealed doors of the aircraft, miles above the clouds no one in the cabin could see, two F-35s cut clean lines through open sky, their engines a distant hum against the vast silence, their pilots scanning instruments. Patterns, nothing out of place, nothing unusual, just another routine patrol in controlled airspace, until a faint signal flickered at the edge of their awareness, not loud, not urgent, just there, like something remembered rather than heard. Back in seat 16A, Hayes exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried weight without effort, and without looking up, without raising his voice. He reached down and pressed the worn switch on the side of the radio, the click barely audible over the low murmur of the cabin, and when he spoke, it wasn't to Cole, it wasn't to anyone on that plane, it was to somewhere far beyond it, somewhere only a few people in the world would ever understand. "This is ugly 6, do you copy?" For a fraction of a second nothing happened, and that was what made it unsettling, because the words had not been loud, they had not carried across the cabin, and yet something about them seemed to settle into the air like a weight no one could quite explain. Officer Ryan Cole let out a short breath through his nose, already preparing another sharp reply, already certain he was still in control of this moment. "Yeah, that is not how this works," he said, his tone tightening, but there was a hesitation now, small, almost invisible, as if the calm in Daniel Hayes's voice had disrupted the rhythm he expected. Emily Carter felt it too, that subtle shift, like the cabin had leaned a degree off balance. She glanced toward the cockpit door without fully knowing why, her instincts pulling her attention somewhere beyond the argument in front of her, because she had worked enough flights to recognize when something ordinary stopped being ordinary. 30,000 feet above the earth, the sky stretched endless and clear, the horizon a thin pale line separating blue from blue, inside the lead F-35. Cockpit Lieutenant Jason Mercer scanned his instruments with practiced ease, the hum of the aircraft steady, predictable, until a flicker of sound cut through his headset, faint, almost dismissed by his brain before it registered. He frowned slightly, adjusting the channel. "Say again," he muttered under his breath, not expecting an answer, not expecting anything at all, but then the signal came again, clearer this time. Not louder, just undeniable, and the words landed with a precision that bypassed logic and went straight to memory. His posture changed instantly, shoulders tightening, eyes sharpening. Control, this is Viper 1, I just picked up an unauthorized transmission. His wingman's voice came in a second later, no longer casual, no longer routine. I heard it too. A pause followed, not confusion, but recognition building, assembling itself piece by piece. Did that just say ugly 6? Mercer did not answer immediately, because he already knew the answer, and knowing it was the problem, because that call sign did not belong in open airspace, it did not belong anywhere routine. Confirm, he said finally, his voice lower now, controlled. Ugly 6 just transmitted, inside the cabin. None of that could be seen, none of it could be heard, and that was what made it worse. Because the world had already begun to move without anyone realizing it. Cole shook his head, dismissing the entire exchange as nonsense. Sir, whatever game you think you are playing, it ends right now. He reached for the radio again, this time intending to remove it, to end the situation cleanly, efficiently, the way he understood authority to work. But Hayes moved first, not quickly, not aggressively, just enough, his hand closing over the device with quiet certainty, and for the first time their eyes met. And in that brief contact Cole felt something he could not name, not fear, not respect, just the sudden awareness that he might be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hayes did not raise his voice, did not explain himself, he simply spoke again, softer if anything. Stand by, as if the instruction was not for the man in front of him but for something far beyond the walls of the aircraft. Emily's breath caught slightly, her training told her to intervene, to de-escalate, but something deeper told her to wait. Because this was no longer a situation she understood, and somewhere high above them, two of the most advanced aircraft in the world had just stopped treating the sky as routine, and started treating it as something else entirely. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that made people shift in their seats without knowing why, and then it broke not inside the cabin but somewhere far above it. Viper 1 to Control, we need immediate verification on a legacy call sign. Repeat, legacy call sign detected. Lieutenant Mercer's voice was no longer casual, every word measured, deliberate. The hum of the aircraft now background to something sharper, more focused. Control responded with routine. Calm at first, the kind built on years of filtering noise from signal. Say again, Viper 1, clarify transmission. Mercer's eyes stayed locked on the horizon even as his mind moved elsewhere, pulling fragments from memory, briefings half remembered, names that were never written down. Call sign is ugly 6, the words landed heavier this time, and the silence that followed was different, not confusion, but recognition reaching the wrong ears at the wrong time, inside a secure operations center miles away. A technician paused mid-keystroke, his screen reflecting a string of data that should not have existed in open civilian airspace. Sir, we just picked something up, he said quietly, and across the room a senior officer turned, already knowing from the tone alone that this was not routine. Repeat that, the officer said, stepping closer. The technician swallowed once before answering. Ugly 6, sir. The room did not erupt, it did not panic, it tightened, every movement becoming more precise, more controlled, because this was the kind of information that did not need volume to carry weight. Verify source, the officer ordered, and within seconds multiple systems began cross-checking, civilian flight paths, encrypted channels, signal origin triangulation, the invisible architecture of command waking up layer by layer. Back in the cabin, none of that movement showed, but its presence could be felt in the subtle shifts that followed. Emily Carter felt it first. As a change in the cockpit door, not visible, not audible, but sensed, like the crew inside had just leaned forward all at once. Her training told her to continue procedures, to maintain calm, but her instincts told her something had just reached them, something outside protocol. Officer Cole did not notice any of it. Or if he did, he refused to acknowledge it, his focus still locked on control, on authority, on restoring what he believed had been disrupted. Sir, I am done asking, he said, his voice firmer now, louder, reclaiming space. You will hand over that device or you will be removed from this aircraft upon landing. A few passengers nodded subtly, comforted by the return of structure, of rules they understood. But Hayes did not react to the threat, did not argue, did not defend, he simply adjusted the small radio in his hand as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered, his thumb resting lightly against its edge. his gaze unfocused, not distant, but directed somewhere no one else could see, and when he spoke again it was not louder, not sharper, just certain. They heard it, he said, almost to himself, as if confirming something already expected. Emily's breath caught again. Because the certainty in that statement did not sound like hope or guesswork, it sounded like knowledge. Like experience repeated too many times to doubt, and somewhere above the clouds, 2 F-35s had already altered their flight pattern by a fraction, subtle enough to remain unnoticed on any civilian radar feed, but deliberate enough to signal a shift from observation to attention. Mercer's wingman spoke again, quieter now. If that is real, we need authorization. Mercer did not take his eyes off the horizon as he answered, we already have it, and far below, inside row 16A, a man who looked like nothing at all had just changed the direction of everything without raising his voice. The shift became visible not through sound but through precision, the kind that only trained eyes would notice. In the cockpit of the commercial aircraft a quiet exchange passed between the captain and first officer, a glance held half a second longer than usual, a hand hovering over controls not yet moved, as a new line of communication opened on a secure frequency that had not been used since departure. Control. Confirm priority routing, the captain said, his voice calm but stripped of routine ease, and the response came back just as measured, just as controlled. Stand by for updated vector, maintain current altitude, no explanation, no elaboration, just instruction, and that was enough to change the air inside the cockpit. In the cabin, Emily Carter felt it ripple outward, not as panic but as awareness, the kind that settles in before anyone can name it. She moved slowly down the aisle, her eyes briefly meeting the captain through the narrow opening of the cockpit door before it sealed again, and in that moment she saw it clearly, not fear, not confusion, but focus, the kind reserved for situations that mattered beyond procedure. She turned back toward row 16A, toward the quiet center of everything unfolding. Officer Ryan Cole was still speaking. But his voice had lost something, a sharp edge softened by something he did not yet understand. Sir, this is your final warning, he said, though it no longer carried the same weight, because somewhere beneath his certainty a question had begun to form, small but persistent, and it grew as he noticed the subtle changes around him, the flight attendant no longer intervening, the cockpit sealed tighter than before, the faint shift in engine tone as the aircraft adjusted its climb by a fraction of a degree, none of it dramatic, none of it obvious, but together it formed a pattern he could not ignore. Hayes remained exactly as he had been, seated, composed, his hand resting lightly on the radio now silent again, his gaze steady, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, as if he had already moved beyond this moment and was waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. You should sit down, he said quietly. Not as a command, not even as advice, just a statement placed gently into the air, and for the first time Cole did not respond immediately, because something in those words did not feel like a challenge, it felt like timing. 30,000 feet above them, the 2 F-35s had completed their adjustment, their formation tightening with subtle precision, their systems now tracking a civilian aircraft not as background traffic but as a point of interest. Lieutenant Mercer's voice returned to the channel, steady. Control, we are establishing proximity monitoring, and the response came back without delay, stripped of all ambiguity. Proceed, maintain discretion, which meant authorization without announcement, presence without escalation, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted beyond normal parameters. Inside a secure command room far from both sky and cabin, General Marcus Whitaker stood motionless for a moment after hearing the call sign, his eyes fixed on the data scrolling across the screen, numbers, coordinates, identifiers, all aligning into something he had not expected to see again. Confirm signal integrity, he said, his voice low, and the technician responded immediately. Confirmed, sir, no distortion, no interference. Whitaker nodded once, a small movement carrying years of memory, and then he spoke the words that set everything else into motion. Prepare ground reception. Back in the cabin, no one heard that order, no one saw the systems activate, but they felt the result in the growing stillness, the way conversations faded, the way movement slowed, as if the aircraft itself had entered a different kind of airspace, and in the center of it all, Daniel Hayes sat quietly, as though he had done this before, as though he already knew how it would end. The first sign was not the aircraft, not the engines, not even the movement of the people inside, it was the sky outside the window, where the light shifted just enough to catch the edge of something that did not belong to a normal flight path, a brief flash of motion far off the wing that most passengers would dismiss as glare, but not all of them did. One man in the aisle leaned slightly toward the window, squinting, unsure of what he had seen, while 2 rows back a woman paused mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowing as instinct quietly overrode distraction. Emily Carter noticed at the moment their attention changed, because passengers did not all look in the same direction unless something pulled them there. She followed their gaze, and for a fraction of a second she saw it too, a distant shape cutting through the sky with a precision that did not match commercial air traffic. Her breath slowed, not out of fear but recognition that something had escalated beyond the cabin. Officer Ryan Cole turned as well, irritation giving way to confusion, his authority anchored in the immediate space around him, not in the air miles beyond it. "What is that?" someone asked quietly, not to anyone in particular, just enough for the question to spread without needing an answer. Cole straightened slightly, instinctively reclaiming posture, but the uncertainty lingered in his eyes now, because whatever this was, it had not come from him. Hayes did not look out the window, did not shift in his seat, his attention remained forward, grounded, as if the sky had already answered him before anyone else noticed, his hand resting lightly on the radio, no longer active, no longer needed, his role in the moment already complete. 30,000 feet above, the 2 F-35s closed distance with deliberate restraint, not approaching as a show of force, not announcing themselves, but positioning with exacting care, their presence calculated to be seen only when it needed to be. Lieutenant Mercer adjusted his heading by a fraction, aligning with the commercial aircraft's vector, his voice steady on the secure channel. Visual acquired, his wingman responded immediately, maintaining offset, the formation held, silent, controlled, a conversation written in movement rather than words. Inside the cockpit of the airliner, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but different now, stripped of its usual warmth, replaced with clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received updated routing instructions and will be adjusting our course slightly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." It was a standard message delivered in a standard way, but the timing was not standard, and those who were paying attention felt it, the alignment between the unseen sky and the subtle change in direction. Cole lowered his hand slowly, no longer reaching for the radio, no longer certain what removing it would accomplish, his focus shifting from control to understanding. But understanding was not something he could access yet, not at his level, not in this moment. He looked at Hayes again, searching for something, an explanation, a reaction, anything that would restore the balance he had lost, but Hayes gave him none, only the same quiet presence, the same steady breathing, the same unshaken posture of a man who had already moved past the need to explain himself. Emily stepped back slightly, creating space without realizing it, her instincts now fully engaged, not to manage the situation, but to witness it, because something told her that whatever was unfolding did not need interference, it needed recognition. Outside the window, the distant shape resolved just enough for those who knew to recognize it, sleek, angular, unmistakable, and as it held position off the wing at a respectful distance, the cabin grew quieter, not from instruction, not from fear, but from the slow, undeniable realization that the ordinary rules no longer applied. And in seat 16A, Daniel Hayes remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, unchanged, as the world around him adjusted instead. The realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a pattern coming into focus piece by piece, the shape outside the window holding steady now, no longer a question but a fact, its presence too deliberate to be coincidence, too precise to be ignored, and as more passengers began to notice, the quiet spread in a way that no announcement could ever achieve. Conversations faded mid-sentence, eyes turned, bodies leaned subtly toward the glass as if proximity might bring understanding, and yet no one spoke loudly, because something about the moment demanded restraint. Officer Ryan Cole felt it fully now, not just the shift in the cabin, but the loss of ground beneath his certainty, the rules he had relied on no longer fitting the situation in front of him. His posture softened without him realizing it, his voice absent where it had once been sharp, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he did not know what to say, his gaze moving from the aircraft outside to the man seated in 16A, trying to connect the two, trying to find a line between them that made sense, but there was none that he could see. Emily Carter stood a few steps back, her hands loosely clasped, her training telling her to maintain calm, but her instincts telling her to observe, because this was no longer something to manage, it was something to witness. She glanced once more toward the cockpit, where the door remained firmly closed, the crew inside now operating in a different rhythm, a different layer of awareness, and she understood then that whatever was happening had already been accepted at a level far above her own. In the sky, the two F-35s adjusted again, not closing distance, not retreating, but matching speed with exact precision, a silent escort that spoke louder than any formation display. Lieutenant Mercer's eyes tracked the commercial aircraft with unwavering focus, his voice returning to the channel, lower now, carrying a weight that had not been there before. Control, escort position established. The response came back immediately, equally controlled, equally measured. Maintain until handoff, no elaboration, no explanation, just continuation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been understood. Far below, inside a secured operations center, General Marcus Whitaker stood with his hands resting lightly on the edge of the console, his gaze fixed on the live feed, the data no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, but real, present, unfolding in front of him. Estimated arrival, he asked without looking away, and the technician responded with precision. 42 minutes, sir. Whitaker nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then added quietly, have the runway cleared and personnel ready. There was no urgency in his voice, only certainty, the kind that came from knowing exactly who was on that aircraft. Back in the cabin, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, steady but carrying a subtle firmness that had not been there before. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your cooperation as we continue under updated routing. Please remain seated. The message was simple, controlled, but the timing aligned too closely with what they could now see outside, and even those who did not understand felt that alignment. That connection between unseen decisions and visible consequences. Cole finally stepped back, just a single step, but enough to break the stance he had held from the beginning. His eyes lingering on Hayes for a moment longer, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would anchor the situation back into something familiar, but Hayes offered none. He simply sat there, calm, composed, his presence unchanged as the world around him shifted to accommodate something it had not expected. And in that stillness, in that quiet certainty, the balance of power completed its reversal without a single raised voice. The aircraft began its descent so gradually that most passengers did not notice it at first, only a subtle shift in the angle of the horizon outside the window, a slight change in the engine tone that blended into the background of steady flight, but for those already watching, already aware, it felt like the next step in something far larger than a routine landing. The distant escort maintained its position with unwavering precision, neither approaching nor falling away, a constant presence that no longer needed explanation. Inside the cabin, the quiet had deepened into something almost deliberate, not forced, not instructed, but shared, as if every person on board had unconsciously agreed that this was no longer a moment for casual conversation. Emily Carter moved slowly down the aisle once more, her steps measured, her usual rhythm replaced with something more careful, more attentive. She paused briefly near row 16A, not to intervene, not to speak, but simply to observe, her eyes resting on Daniel Hayes for a fraction longer than before, searching for something she could not quite define, but all she found was the same calm presence, unchanged, untouched by everything unfolding around him. Officer Ryan Cole stood a few feet away now, no longer blocking the aisle, no longer asserting control, his arms lowered at his sides, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, his attention shifting between the window and the man he had confronted only minutes earlier. The connection between the two now undeniable, even if he could not explain it, and that realization settled heavily, not as fear, but as the quiet recognition that he had misjudged something important. In the cockpit, the captain's voice remained steady as he coordinated with ground control, the instructions now precise, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. Cleared for priority approach, the response confirmed, and with it came a subtle tightening of procedure, every movement deliberate, every adjustment calculated, because priority did not mean urgency, it meant significance. High above and slightly behind, the two F-35s adjusted their altitude in perfect synchronization, their presence still visible but never intrusive, a silent confirmation of authority rather than a display of it. Lieutenant Mercer glanced once at the aircraft below, his expression unchanged, his focus absolute, because this was not a moment for curiosity, it was a moment for execution, and everything about it had already been decided long before he ever heard the call sign. Miles ahead, the runway had already been cleared, ground vehicles repositioned, personnel standing by in a formation that did not draw attention but carried unmistakable intent. General Marcus Whitaker stood near the edge of the tarmac, his posture straight, his gaze fixed on the sky where a small shape would soon appear. He did not speak, did not move unnecessarily, because this was not a situation that required explanation, only presence. Back inside the descending aircraft, the captain made one final announcement, his tone calm but carrying a subtle weight that had not been there before. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly, please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. It was routine in words, but not in meaning, and as the cabin prepared for landing, the stillness remained, unbroken, as if everyone understood that what awaited them on the ground would not be ordinary. Daniel Hayes adjusted slightly in his seat, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, his hand resting once more on the worn radio at his side, not activating it, not needing to, his role already complete, his presence already acknowledged, and as the aircraft descended through the final layer of cloud, the runway coming into view beneath them, the quiet certainty of what was about to happen settled fully into place. The wheels touched the runway with a controlled, measured firmness, the kind of landing that spoke not of urgency but of precision, the aircraft rolling forward under steady deceleration as the engines shifted tone, reversing thrust in a smooth, practiced rhythm, and yet even in that familiar sequence, something felt different, not in the mechanics but in the meaning behind it, because outside the windows, beyond the edge of the runway, the scene waiting for them did not match any normal arrival. The escort in the sky peeled away at the exact moment the aircraft committed fully to the ground, disappearing with the same quiet authority with which it had arrived, leaving behind only the memory of its presence. But that absence did not return things to normal, it only confirmed that whatever had happened was now moving to its next stage. Inside the cabin, no one rushed to stand, no one reached for overhead bins, the usual impatience of landing replaced by a stillness that held everyone in place, eyes drawn toward the windows, toward the tarmac where vehicles had been positioned with deliberate spacing, not crowded, not chaotic, but intentional, a line of black SUVs, a pair of unmarked service trucks, and further back, figures standing at attention in uniforms that carried weight even at a distance. Emily Carter remained near the aisle, her training guiding her to begin post-landing procedures. But her body hesitated, her attention pulled outward, because she understood now that this was no longer about managing passengers, it was about witnessing something she had never seen before. Officer Ryan Cole stood silent, his earlier authority now fully replaced by observation, his gaze fixed on the scene outside, his mind trying to reconcile the chain of events that had led here, the small radio, the quiet voice, the call sign, the aircraft in the sky, and now this. A reception that did not belong to any civilian arrival, and slowly, without anyone needing to say it, the realization settled that the man seated just a few feet away was the center of it all. The aircraft came to a complete stop, the engines winding down into a low hum, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, no announcement, no movement, just a pause, as if the world itself was taking a breath before the next step. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but carrying a tone none of the passengers had heard before. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated, we will be opening the forward doors shortly. No explanation followed, none was needed, because outside, the figures had already begun to move, not rushing, not signaling, but aligning, forming a quiet corridor that led directly to the aircraft's front exit. General Marcus Whitaker stood at the center of that formation, his presence unmistakable even from a distance, his posture straight, his gaze fixed on the aircraft with unwavering focus. He did not check his watch, did not speak to those around him, because timing was no longer a variable, it was a certainty. Inside the cabin, the door mechanism engaged with a soft mechanical sound, the seal releasing, the first physical connection between the interior and the world outside, and as the door slowly opened, a wave of bright daylight spilled into the front of the aircraft, illuminating the aisle in a way that felt almost symbolic, as if drawing a line between what had been and what was about to happen. Daniel Hayes remained seated for a moment longer, unmoved by the shift, his hands resting calmly, his expression unchanged, and then, without urgency, without hesitation, He reached down and picked up the small worn radio, holding it not as an object of importance, but as something long familiar, and as he stood, the movement was simple, unremarkable in form, but in that moment, it carried a weight that no one in the cabin could ignore, because everything outside was already waiting for him. The cabin parted without anyone being told to move, not out of instruction but out of instinct, as Daniel Hayes stepped into the aisle and began walking forward with a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, each step measured, quiet, unremarkable in sound yet impossible to ignore, the worn radio resting in his hand like something that had long ago stopped needing explanation, and as he passed each row, the eyes that followed him were no longer curious, no longer doubtful, they were still, attentive, as if everyone present understood that whatever this was, it was not meant to be interrupted. Emily Carter stepped back to the side, giving him a clear path without thinking, her posture shifting subtly from service to respect, her gaze steady, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet clarity that did not need words. While Officer Ryan Cole remained where he stood, unmoving, his authority left. Somewhere behind him, his expression no longer questioning but fixed, absorbing the moment as it unfolded beyond anything he had been trained to handle, the open doorway at the front of the aircraft framed the outside world in sharp, bright light, the tarmac stretching forward with precise symmetry, the vehicles aligned, the personnel already in position, and at the center of it all stood General Marcus Whitaker, waiting, not impatiently, not ceremonially, but with a stillness that carried its own gravity. Hayes reached the front of the cabin and paused only long enough for the final step to clear, then moved forward into the light, crossing the threshold from the confined space of the aircraft into the open air without hesitation, and the moment his foot touched the tarmac, the reaction came not as noise but as movement, a unified shift as every uniformed figure present straightened, their posture aligning in perfect silence. Not exaggerated, not performed, but precise, deliberate. Earned, General Whitaker took a single step forward, closing the distance with controlled purpose, his eyes locked on Hayes, not scanning, not evaluating, but recognizing, and when he stopped, it was at exactly the distance required, no closer, no further, his hand rising in a clean, unwavering salute that cut through the air with absolute clarity, and for a brief moment, nothing else existed, not the aircraft, not the passengers watching from inside, not the vehicles or the personnel, only that single gesture, held in silence. Hayes did not rush his response, did not mirror the movement immediately, he simply stood there, meeting the general's gaze with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning, and then, with quiet precision, he returned the salute, not as acknowledgement of rank, but as recognition of something deeper, something shared, something that did not need to be spoken. Inside the cabin, the silence deepened, not from confusion but from understanding, the kind that settles slowly and stays. Emily felt it in the stillness of her own breath, Cole felt it in the weight of what he had misjudged, and across every row, the passengers remained seated, watching, not out of obligation, but because something in the moment held them there. The salute ended, but the respect did not. Whitaker lowered his hand and spoke only one sentence, his voice calm, steady, carrying without effort, "Permission to escort you, sir," and Hayes gave a small nod, nothing more, no explanation, no introduction, just acceptance, and as they turned together, walking side by side across the tarmac, the formation adjusted around them with seamless precision, the vehicles ready, the path already cleared, everything aligned not for display, but for purpose. Back inside the aircraft, no one moved for several seconds after they were gone, as if the absence itself required time to settle, and when the first passenger finally reached for an overhead bin, it was done quietly, carefully, as though the space they occupied had been changed in a way that could not be undone, and somewhere beyond the runway, beyond the structures and the waiting vehicles, the sky stretched wide and empty again, holding no trace of what had just passed through it, except for those who had heard the call and understood what it meant, because respect is not created in the moment it is seen, it is carried long before, and recognized only when the world is ready to see it.